Now I want to introduce James Lynn Woodworth, the Commissioner of the National Center for Education Statistics, which administers NAEP. Lynn?
Good afternoon. I'm Lynn Woodworth, the Commissioner of the National Center for Education Statistics, known as NCES. It's a privilege to be here with you today, at least virtually, to participate in the release event for the results of the NAEP Civics, Geography, and U.S. History Assessment. As NCES Commissioner, I'm opening up the official statistics portion of today's event. The portion of today's event that's around statistics needs to be kept separate from the policy aspects of the rest of the event. And we'll close at the end of the question and answer period after Associate Commissioner Carr's presentation of the results. NAEP was created to fulfill the second half of NCS's congressional mandate to report on the condition and progress of education in the states and territories, a mandate that dates back to 1867 when the first Federal Department of Education, which became NCES, was chartered by Congress. NCES is proud to be the agency responsible for NAEP program, from designing and administering each assessment to reporting the results of each assessment to the American public. Today at 12:01 EM Eastern Time, NCS officially released the results of the performance of U.S. 8th graders on the 2018 National Assessment of Education Progress, assessments in U.S. history, civics, and geography. In my commissioner's statement, which accompanied the release of the results, I highlighted key takeaway points that hopefully you will glean from the presentation of results today. Results showed declines compared to 2014 in 2 of the 3 social studies subjects, U.S. history and geography. These declines were particularly evident among our lowest performers. The declines in U.S. history were pervasive. There were declines across various historical themes, most of the performance distribution, and various subgroups. Finally, across the 3 subjects, a quarter or fewer of 8th graders were at or above NAEP proficient, while a quarter or more are below NAEP basic. Please keep in mind that NAEP proficient refers to a solid mastery over challenging subject matter. It is my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Peggy Carr, who will be presenting the full results from the assessment. In the context of our statistical standards, Dr. Carr will detail results over time for U.S. students overall and for different student groups, highlighting performance for the NAEP achievement levels, NAEP Basic, NAEP Proficient, and NAEP Advanced. Dr. Carr is the Associate Commissioner for Assessment at NCES, a role she has held for nearly 2 decades. She is responsible for NCES's portfolio of national and international large-scale assessments, including NAEP, the Program for International Student Assessments, or PISA, Trends in International Mathematics and Science Study, Progress in International Reading and Literacy Study, and the Program of International Assessment and Adult Competencies. Dr. Carr.
Thank you, Commissioner. I am certainly pleased to share the results from the 2018 NAEP Social Studies Assessments, U.S. History, Civics, Geography, and History. I can say that 5 years ago, when we released these results, I can recall there were no changes. It was a pretty flat set of results that we were sharing. But today, we're going to see a different pattern, some changes. I think we're going to start out by looking at or sort of seeing what it is students were actually asked to do. What were students performing, how they were asked to perform on these assessments, I should say. Let's take a look.
Today's 8th graders will soon be tomorrow's adult citizens, and their knowledge of our nation's history, the functions of government, and our world and its inhabitants will be important to our nation's future. To better understand what students know and can do in these important areas, in 2018, NAEP assessed 8th graders' knowledge and skills in U.S. history, civics, and geography. In the U.S. history, the NAEP assessment asked students to demonstrate their knowledge of 4 U.S. history themes: democracy, culture, technology, and rural role. And these themes covered 8 time periods of our nation's history. Students who performed at or above the proficient level demonstrated a variety of skills, including the ability to explain the significance and connection of people, places, events, ideas, and documents, recognize opportunities, perspectives, and challenges of a diverse population, and understand historical themes while citing evidence from primary and secondary sources to support conclusions. In civics, NAEP measures students' performance in 5 content areas: civic life, politics, and government, foundation of the American political system, the purposes, values, and principles of American democracy, relationship of the United States to other nations, and roles of citizens in American democracy. In addition, the civics assessment measures students' intellectual and participatory skills, as well as civic dispositions. The NAEP proficient students can explain and understand differences between government and civic society and American ideas and reality, separation of powers among branches of government, and how citizens can influence government and events that have international consequences. In geography, the NAEP measures 3 content areas: space and place, environment and society, spatial dynamics and connections. It also measured 3 cognitive areas: knowing, understanding, applying. And NAEP proficient students can understand, describe, and explain fundamental vocabulary, analytical concepts, physical and cultural features, and regional patterns. Locational questions requiring integration of 2 or more geographic sources. Case studies about how regions influence trade and migration patterns and cultural and political interaction. Let me give you a brief overview of our data collection efforts before I share the results.
We administered the assessment between January and March of 2018 to over 13,000 students in civics, geography, and 16,000 students for U.S. history. 2018 marked the first time we administered these assessments digitally. We assigned paper and digital assessments randomly to students and used both samples to produce the 2018 results you'll see today. I'd like to first remind you all of the big picture results that Dr. Woodworth shared in his introductory remarks. Since 2014, two out of the 3 subjects showed a decline: U.S. history and geography. Civics, well, the results there were flat. But over the long term, as you can see here, civics and U.S. history have improved, while geography scores showed no difference from the first time we assessed these subjects. I want to start my review with the civics results. And before I share the results, I want to highlight some of the questions that students were asked to respond to. Starting here with civics, this is a multiple choice question, but I should point out that it represents only a type of question that students were asked. This is a multiple choice question. More of the questions, more of the time students were asked to spend really represented constructed response questions where they had to justify and explain their answer. For this particular question here, the Constitution requires the president's nomination to Superior Court to be approved by the Senate. Students were asked to look at these various options and provide their choice, of course. I want to share that we actually put this question up on Twitter and asked you, our audience, what the right answer was. And I'm pleased to say that 69% of our Twitter followers gave the right response. As for our eighth graders, 40% of our students who answered this question were able to identify the correct answer. I'm going to now look into the overall results for civics, but I want to first orient you to the graph. This is the trend line of the average scores for the NAEP Civics assessment. Note here that it started in 1998. The average scores for each year are displayed here, and asterisks indicate scores that are significantly different from the score in 2018. To the right, you see cut points for the NAEP achievement levels: NAEP Basic, NAEP Proficient, and NAEP Advanced. In 2018, the average civics score was 153, not different from the score in 2014, but it was higher than the score in 1998. I'll also note here that none of the racial, ethnic, or gender subgroups showed any change compared to the previous assessment. It's important to dig underneath the average and look at trends for students across various performance levels. Here are the trend lines for students at selected percentiles: 10th and 25th, representing lower achieving students; 50th, those who perform near the average; and 75th and 90th, the higher performing students. Again, you see the achievement level cut points to the right to provide more context about students' performance at these percentiles. If you look at the last 2 years, you see no asterisks, indicating no change in scores across the percentiles. Over the long term, we did see improvement for lower performing students, that is, those at the 10th and 25th percentiles, again indicated by the asterisk. Moving from scale scores to achievement levels, here's a chart of percentages of students reaching the achievement levels. At the top line, starting at the far left, you'll see that 27% are below NAEP Basic, 49% are at NAEP Basic, 21% are at NAEP Proficient, and 2% have reached the NAEP Advanced level. Based on unrounded numbers, 24% of students are at or above the NAEP Proficient in civics. This percentage is unchanged from any of the previous years. Over the long haul, the percentage of students below NAEP Basic is smaller. We're going to move on now to history. Okay, for those of you who missed the last question or did not respond on Twitter, here's another chance. Now, this question asked students about American Indians living east of the Mississippi River between 1800 and 1850. Most were forced to move west of the Mississippi River. Most were forced to work as slaves on plantations or encouraged to become American citizens or forced onto reservations. Well, the correct answer, of course, here is A, and 45% of our students were able to answer that question correctly. Here is the national trend line for the U.S. history assessment. As you can see from the asterisks, the score declined in recent years, but is higher than it was in 1994. For notable subgroup changes, there are for some of our racial ethnic groups: white, Black, Hispanic, and students who identified as 2 or more races. Also, both boys and girls all show declines compared to 2014. If you look across the percentiles, you'll see declines at the 10th, 25th, 50th, and 75th percentile compared to 2014. That overall decline that you see is being felt across the entire distribution, except at the 90th percentile, our highest performing students. However, over the long haul, you see improvement at all percentiles except at the 90th. As mentioned in the overview, we also report scores for 4 U.S. history themes. This breakdown allows you to see how students perform within those history constructs. Compared to 2014, scores declined in all 4 themes. Change in continuity in American democracy, noted here as democracy. Gathering and interaction of people, culture, and ideas, noted here as culture. Economic and technological changes in their relation to society, ideas, and environment, noted here as technology. And the changing role of America in the world, shown here as world role. Over the long term, scores improved in 2 themes, democracy and world role, but decline in technology. In 2018, 15% of students reached or exceeded NAEP proficient in U.S. history. Half of the students were at NAEP basic, and about a third were below NAEP basic. In conjunction with score declines, we see a lower percentage at or above NAEP proficient compared to 2014. Over the long term, there was no change in the percentage of students at or above NAEP proficient, but a smaller percentage below NAEP basic. Now we're going to turn to our final subject, geography. I have one final question I want to share with you. Here we test student skills on locating cities around the world. You can test your own skills here as I reveal the results. As you can see, 26% of 8th graders got this question correct. That would be they got all of the answers correct. We did give partial credit if students gave some of the correct answers. In 2018, the average score declined from 261 in 2014 to 258. There was no change from the average score in 1994. Some notable subgroup declines are for both Black and white students, as well as both male and female students. Turning our attention to the percentile scores, we see that lower achieving students show declines compared to 2014. In the long term, higher achieving students declined while percentiles remained flat. Like U.S. history, we can also report on subscales for geography. There are 3: space and place, environment and society, and spatial dynamics and connections. Compared to 2014, there were declines in 2 of the 3 content areas, space and place, and environment and society. Around a quarter of the students met or exceeded the NAEP proficient cut point. This percentage did not change compared to 2014, but is lower than the 28% in 1994. The proportion of students below NAEP basic grew from 25% in 2014 to 29% in 2018. Now, to summarize, I'll just make a few points about takeaways. The percentage of students at or above NAEP proficient in these subjects notably are lower than in other subjects we typically report on, with U.S. history being the lowest amongst all NAEP assessments. But keep in mind that students must be able to both understand and explain complex content to reach these aspirational goals of NAEP proficient. In other words, these assessments require more than just memorization. As I end my presentation, I would like to thank the students, the teachers, the school officials, the NAEP staff, and the contractors to help make this assessment possible. We could not have done it with each and every one of them. I'll be happy to take questions at this point.
Good. The first question that we have from our audience is, the results show that economically disadvantaged students performed much lower than their peers who are not from disadvantaged backgrounds. The same has been true in reading and math. What message should we take from this?
Well, this is these series of assessments, the U.S. history, civics, and geography. They are challenging assessments. And I think that they are showing us nothing different in terms of how students perform on them than the reading and math. These students are struggling. And I think the students at the bottom of the distribution for all of these subjects, particularly those at the 10th percentile, are struggling the most. It's a signal, it's a big red flag that we need to dig deeper into what is happening with these students at the bottom of the distribution, largely populated and represented by students who are at the lower end of our income distribution. We have a lot of data about what students are doing in these classes, in their schools, what type of areas the teachers are focusing on. I would encourage people to go to our NAEP Data Explorer and dig into these data to develop the hypothesis that might lead us to more firm conclusions and estimations about what is going on with our students.
The next question, participant is commenting that 30 years ago, social studies was the central core of curriculum program and reading was more peripheral. Essentially, in the place we are today, that's been flipped, but reading performance improvement has been sketchy and flat, and social studies has been too. Can you talk about how the two subjects are linked and what evidence points from NAEP we can provide to reconsider curriculum focus to social studies?
Well, you know, these social studies assessments, they have a lot of constructive response questions for the students to respond to and explain and justify their answers. They have to be able to read and understand and interpret what they're being able to ask. And if they're struggling with reading, they're going to struggle with this assessment if they're struggling to comprehend what they're being asked. Now, we, of course, do not administer our reading assessments to the same students that are administered these assessments. And so it's a hypothesis, an area for researchers to explore and analyze more closely. But I think the picture is very clear here.
We have a question asking, do the students feel that U.S. history or history in general is boring or not valuable to know?
Well, you know, I don't think we asked students that particular question, but we did ask something very similar to this notion that students aren't knowledgeable or don't feel confident in these subject areas. And what we found is that about 25 to 50% of the students said that they're not really confident that they know these facts and the events and periods and times that are associated with these questions that we're asking them about. And this is in sharp comparison to when we ask these same questions about reading and mathematics, where a half to 2/3 of the students feel that they're very confident in these subject areas. So students don't feel very good about what they know in these subjects.
Several people are asking about state level results, whether there are any for this, and when we might be able to expect those, if we might.
Well, we've never collected state level results for U.S. history, civics, or geography. It's something I think the governing board would really like to do moving forward. If you take a look at the schedule for the U.S. history and civics, further in the published schedule, there may be a state level assessment coming on board in a few years.
Another question on history. Were you surprised that the U.S. history results were so much worse than those for geography and civics, which tend not to be taught as separate subjects, and why might this be?
Well, I wasn't surprised because I've been reporting on these results for a while now, since the early 90s. And I can tell you this finding of the comparison of the three subjects has been quite consistent. The U.S. history is a challenging assessment. Students are asked about a lot of facts and people, places, events, and they're asked to make connections between them. A lot of critical thinking, higher order thinking skills are associated with all of these assessments, but it's particularly true of the history assessment. So no, I wasn't surprised. Sobering, of course, only 15% proficient, but not surprised.
I have a question about the connection between these and reading. To score well on these subjects, students need to be good readers. Can you comment on the link between this and scoring well on these tests?
Well, as I said earlier, you need those fundamental skills to be able to comprehend what you're being asked to do. And there's a lot of requirements for students to really read and understand and make the connections between the facts and the knowledge and the skills that represent the fundamental parts of these assessments. I think what we need to do moving forward is to better understand how these subjects connect. We're having opportunities, for example, to perhaps correlate these subjects in the future when we look into different designs moving forward. But for now, it's an association that we are observing that is very enlightening about the relationship between reading and these subjects. We know that students are asked to explain and justify their answers, and there's quite a bit of time that needs to be spent in this area on these subjects, about 50% or more of the time.
The question about the content of the history assessment: are students tested with regard to understanding historical perspective, understanding context, understanding how to consider current issues in historical context, or did it test only facts?
What was that? Oh, you were not clear. Could you repeat the latter part of your question?
Yes, it was a question asking about whether students are tested about understanding historical perspective, context, and current issues in historical context, or did it test only facts?
Oh, no, not just facts. It's not just memorization. They needed to know those things, of course, but they needed to be able to make the connection between those facts, the events, people, places, the requirement to make higher order inferences about these facts and activities that happened in the past, historical events was a major part of what these assessments were about.
Can you clarify, was this assessment the first time to be delivered on a computer? And if so, did the computer administration have anything to do with the lower results that you're seeing?
No, absolutely not. Let me first verify that this was the first digitally based assessment, but the results that we're seeing are the results associated with performance, not change in the mode of the administration. And we know this because of the way we design the study, randomly assigning equivalent groups of students to paper versus digitally based assessment, and analyzing the data such that the trend, whether it's an increase or a decrease, the trend that we see is largely driven by the paper part of the study, not the digital component.
Great. I think we have time for one more question, which would be, do you think students will do better if the test was read to them?
No, I don't actually. What we're seeing here is that students don't know the content. They don't know the content. They don't know how to make the connections between the content. So I have no vision from my understanding of the findings that having the information read to them will make them perform better. Now, you do have students that are perhaps struggling and reading, students at the bottom. Perhaps they could perform a little better if they understood what they were being asked. But for the most part, we're seeing here that the students don't know the content and how to make those critical connections between the facts and the figures and the important things we need them to know. I think that if that was the last question, this concludes the statistical delivery of the results from the NCES part of the event. Thank you very much.